Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs, and I'm the programs manager here at the library. Is anyone here visiting our premises for the first time tonight? Yes, I see a couple hands. If this is your first time, second time, 10th time, if you come every day, welcome. We're so delighted to have you. We've been in operation for over 100 years. We're the largest English language lending library on the European continent, and we're also host to a vibrant array of cultural programming, including evening talks like this and our annual book award, which is how we discovered Madame Chen, who will be presenting her brilliant book tonight. So I highly encourage you to look at our programs calendar to see other upcoming events as well. Tonight, it is such a pleasure and such a privilege to be joined by the absolutely brilliant Katherine J. Chen in conversation with Patricia Dailey as they discuss Katherine's wonderful book, Joan, which is the winner of the 2023 American Library in Paris Book Award. Just a couple notes.
Thank you.
Just a couple notes about this conversation. After about 45 minutes, we are going to open it up to questions from our in-person audience, and if we have time, from our Zoom audience as well, who's trapped inside that camera right there. Hello to Zoom. Please send your questions into the chat if you have them, and copies of Joan will be available for purchase following this event, thanks to our partner booksellers, Smith & Son, and Katherine will generously sign a copy or two as well. So if you didn't manage to pick up your copy at the book award ceremony, now is your second chance. Don't miss out on it. On to our wonderful speakers tonight. Katherine J. Chen is the author of Joan, a novel of Joan of Arc, which won the 2023 American Library in Paris Book Award, and Mary B. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times Book Review, Los Angeles Review of Books, Literary Hub, and many other publications. And her next book, under contract with Random House, will explore the complex sibling relationship between Morgan Le Fay and Arthur. She's a graduate of Princeton University and Boston University's MFA fiction program, and she is currently, if writing several novels is not enough, a doctoral student in the Department of English at Brown University. Impressive. And tonight, Katherine is joined by Patricia Dailey. Patricia is an associate professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. Her work spans medieval literature, contemporary philosophy, gender studies, psychedelic studies, and eco-criticism. Fabulous words to say out loud. She is the author of Promised Bodies, Time, Language, and Corporeality in Medieval Women's Mystical Texts, and has authored numerous articles. And she is finishing a book on the arboreal sublime, while also writing an experimental autobiography of parentheses, or what could be called life in parentheses. Even more fabulous words to say out loud. Thank you so much, Patricia. Awarded, as I said, the 2023 American Library in Paris Book Award, Joan offers a nuanced exploration of faith, power, and gender in medieval France. The Book Award Committee said of this book that it is deeply researched and fully imagined. It manages to subvert old, dusty narratives about the ardent virgin warrior from Domremy in eastern France and creates a flawed, complicated, and compelling heroine for our age. Katherine, Patricia, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Can we have a round of applause, please?
I want to know what living a life in parentheses means. That's so intriguing.
We can talk about that after dinner. Okay. So this book was very moving. As a medievalist, I work on a lot of things that seem kind of very inaccessible, and often am suspicious about the ways in which the medieval might be brought to the contemporary. But I was incredibly moved at the way that you are able to render it legible in a way that doesn't necessarily seem anachronistic. So it was really compelling, and also offered a way for readers to kind of understand and situate themselves in relation to medieval material, which I greatly appreciated. And so obviously as a medievalist, I was thinking, how did you get to the medieval? It's not common for people to really look at the Middle Ages as something that can resonate with our contemporary way of understanding, especially women's agency, passion, a sense of spirituality. So Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was more Joan was my entry point into the Middle Ages, and I think the Middle Ages are such it's a difficult period to grasp because it's so large and it's so amorphous, and it tends to have a reputation for, I don't want to say like gloom and doom, but gloom and doom. And I'm thinking specifically of the recent medieval film that came out that was, I think, directed by Ridley Scott, The Duel, which starred Adam Driver and Matt Damon. And I remember, like, in the YouTube comments for the trailer, people would just say, like, why is the weather in the medieval times, like, always cloudy and rainy? Like, were there no blue skies and no sun? And why is everyone dressed, like, in gray and, like, looks so miserable? But I would say that, so since Joan was my entry point into the Middle Ages, I actually found it to be an extremely vibrant and colorful time. And specifically, I'm remembering a book that I briefly read about how in the manuscripts that they would very painstakingly write, by hand, that, like, if there was a typo, they would create, like, a little drawing in the margins to, like, insert, like, the correction, like the so there would be like a little drawing of a person literally with a lever or something, like a tool to insert the correction to the typo. And I thought that was just, it's like so playful and so whimsical, and also like learning about not even just like medieval cuisine, just like the eccentricities of the fashion of the time. That's also so symbolic and vibrant as well. But it's really interesting. I didn't start off wanting to write about Joan. I wanted to write about Christ. And I was inspired by a very specific painting, which was Christ in the House of His Parents by John Everett Millay. And it's a beautiful, beautiful painting. And it generated a lot of controversy at the time, which is, it shows like Christ obviously as a child with a wound on his palm. And his mother, Mary, is like kneeling next to him and wants to tend to the wound. But I think like Dickens hated it, and people said, like, why are you portraying Christ and these like seminal figures in such a way? Like, I don't want to see the Virgin Mary as this like ugly redhead
mother?
ugly mother. And so I was also thinking of that painting in relationship to Colm Toibin's book, The Testament of Mary, which has like a very, I don't want to say similar treatment to Christ, but it just brings him down to eye level.
Right.
And one of the most memorable scenes in that book is the crucifixion of Christ, when specifically a moment where Christ is being pinned, and he's in pain, and you see him like struggle with the hand that's already nailed down. And so I was just, as a thought experiment, it was interesting for me to consider what it would mean to humanize like a legendary, like a historic, but like legendary, almost mythical figure like Joan of Arc. And so I was fortunate that through her, I was able to learn more about the Middle Ages. So I think that happened through the character versus through the time period. And there's this, I like to tell the story about like how I came to write about her, which is that, so I wanted originally to write about Christ, but when I was thinking about subjects to write about for my next work, I was looking over my bookshelves, and I remember I was unemployed at the time, like jobless. I'm so typical of my generation that I can't hold down a job. I've actually counted, so like at some point you begin to be proud of the number of times that you've been laid off or fired. Like, it really hurts the first time. And then, like, you realize, like, as you accumulate the number of times you've been fired, it's like 4 times. And then you realize, like, you're really not cut out for the 9-to-5, like, office job. And you have a problem with authority, which is something that you have in common with Joan of Arc. So I remember, like, looking at the bookshelves, and there was just this beautiful gold hardcover book. It was a biography of Joan of Arc by Helen Castor. Who you might
know that. No.
Okay, so she's a famous historian. Like, she's known for a book called She-Wolves.
Oh
So that like book was, it was one of those like impulse buys, like a pretty cover, and then you don't read it. Yeah, so I bought it at the time and brought it home and just didn't even open it to the first page. And since I was jobless, I started reading the biography and had like a great time with it. And I didn't hold myself to anything. I just thought like if the subject works out, it works out. And if it doesn't, it doesn't, because after all, it's Joan of Arc. She's been written thousands of times before.
Yeah.
So
wow, totally impressive. Wow, it's very courageous. Yeah. I have a question about translating Joan into the present, about that choice then to write about her. That one of the things that really struck me about this is that you're not trying to make, you're actually very careful about a lot of historical details. So you're situating Joan in a certain kind of a context. And I mean, I was excited to see, some of the Arnaud Daniel, being referenced, and some of the contemporary trouvères, troubadours, the kind of the ways, things that people like me, the nerds would recognize. But you also contextualize it in a way, obviously, as everybody's pointed out, is a very alive and familiar Joan. So I was wondering about the question of translation, because you're translating a number of things, not just from, you could say, a French context into the English language, or from the Middle Ages to contemporary, but also about the role of spirituality and how do we understand spirituality now. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that choice to translate what is thought of as a very overt, performed spirituality that might seem very dogmatic and might seem also very rebellious, but you're treading a very interesting line in the way that you're thinking about her in relation to institutions, to people, to even how she understands her own actions.
yeah, so one thing, that was really great. One thing, like this is how professors talk, and this shows the discrepancy between the professor and the graduate student, where like professors can just like open their mouths and eloquence flowers kind of like a bouquet.
I don't know. This is pretty eloquent, if you ask me. I don't know.
Okay, now I've lost my train of thought because I complimented you. I was thinking about, so as I guess a fiction writer, my loyalty, I suppose, is always to the world of the imagination and the novel, and the world that, the world building within that novel versus history itself. And I've always had a problem with the visions, despite what, Joan of Arc diehards would say about her relationship to the visions, and about just the relationship, the concept of piousness as well, which for me is so individual, like speaking of my own faith in God. And so I realized that as I was writing the book, so it's interesting, I came up with a draft of the novel that was actually a little over 200,000 words. That was a first draft. And in that novel, that version of the novel is very, it abides to history almost to a T. So it's almost like I read all these biographies of Joan and then decided to like have this timeline and then tick all the boxes of like what happens when. And it's interesting like how the visions, specifically the saints, so Catherine and Margaret, how they translated onto the page, which is that instead of being very serious visions, they became almost comic relief in that first draft of the novel, which obviously didn't work. I think I have a major problem with historical fiction, that it's almost like a dramatized biography, and you're going through like facts and years and dates and basically adding, descriptives like adverbs and adjectives here and there, and inserting like interesting anecdotes and facts. I don't think that is a good novel. So I think it was more interesting for me, not as someone who thinks a lot about craft and who thinks about like the coherence of a work and the value of that work and how it adds an angle of freshness or a dimension of freshness to a figure who's been written about so extensively. I wanted to do something like new, and someone who someone who was obviously hugely influential for me was Hilary Mantel and what she did with Thomas Cromwell, with Wolf Hall, and I just found it extraordinary that a work of fiction could transform people's ideas of a character who has been so villainized. And so you have, Man for All Seasons, which champions Thomas More, and then you have Wolf Hall, all these decades later, that champions Cromwell, and it turns people's minds like 180 degrees. And then you have all these historians who are, really upset. Some of them are upset, and some of them haven't even read the novel, like Wolf Hall, and they're upset anyway. And so I just thought it was really interesting how fiction can have a voice in altering history and people's perceptions. Like I'm even thinking about how Voltaire wrote about Joan of Arc, and it was such it was so subversive and just perverse, and as you would expect of Voltaire. But also because I think the work was banned, people read it that just encourages people to read it more. And so it's interesting how certain narratives of Joan of Arc dominate for certain periods of time. And now, in terms of fictionalized versions of Joan of Arc, I think of Mark Twain's novel, which I'm just gonna say it, I think it sucks.
Pretty bad.
It's so bad. And
so
people like it because it's Mark Twain. Yeah. And he says it's his best novel, but that doesn't matter. It still sucks. So I think in terms of, my familiarizing myself with a subject, I'm also looking for gaps in where I can insert myself in the canon of Joan's work, and whether such a space exists for me.
Huh, interesting. I'm so glad you said that about Mark Twain, because
people like it. I don't know why. It was interestingly, it was serialized in Harper's, and he spent I think over a decade writing it, and there's so much research involved. But for me, that doesn't matter. Yeah. One thing I will give him credit for is that he Joan was canonized, I believe, in 1920, and I think that novel precedes.
Oh, interesting.
So it's almost like he anticipated her canonization in a sense. Yeah.
Interesting. So going back to spaces of absence, one of the things that I enjoyed about your prose is the style and the way that you write in shorter sentences. You
do I? Okay.
Yeah, no, if we're comparing it to Henry James, who we were talking about, independently. I guess who doesn't in comparison to Henry James, but whatever. But there's a kind of a way in which you don't oversaturate the sentence, that you allow for a lot of breathing room, and that also reflects back on, you could say, on Joan and her kind of a certain kind of simplicity. You have a very good capacity to distill things in a very nicely crystallized and sensorial way that brings, you could say, the cognitive and the sensory together in a very understated, almost laconic way. You don't always you let the reader's intelligence fill in a lot of blanks.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to take that as a compliment.
Yeah, definitely.
I think one thing that I was wary of was, and one thing that I think, if I can recall, Mark Twain doesn't do well, is there are just too many characters. It's really easy for a narrative like this to blow up in terms of cast. And it's also really easy in historical fiction to lose yourself in the details. And ultimately, I think the research will only carry you so far. I kind of liken it to those wings that you wear when you're trying to learn how to swim. They keep you afloat.
I remember.
Yeah, those weird, awkward wings are I think research is kind of like that, but at some point you have to let go of that, and you have to kick off and swim on your own towards an uncertain horizon for the novel to work. And I think that takes balls, it takes guts, and it also invites criticism. But I don't like some amount of controversy is not unwelcome to me. Especially in terms of dealing with this character in a way that I want to deal with her, and also introducing and putting a lot of myself, frankly, like a lot of the personal into this character as well, which I think is essential in humanizing her. I'm thinking too, I was discussing this with someone just the other day about Amadeus, you know, the film and also the play.
The Mozart, yeah.
Yeah, and like how that, you know, that's not historically accurate. But ultimately, it transcends the story of Mozart and Salieri and becomes a story of artistry and envy and what it means to be a genius of one's time, and also what it means to be able to recognize genius when other people can't. And that is kind of a genius in and of itself. But also like having to play second fiddle to someone who is loved by God. And so I kind of think of Joan in that way as well. As being so ahead of her time, like a visionary, and having these gifts, but like what does that mean too? To possess divine gifts that revolve around violence and warfare, and what does that mean? Like what are the implications of that, and how does the character reconcile that?
Yeah.
Too.
So this leads to the role of violence and the ways in which every blow given, as I said before, is a response to a blow received. That there's something in Joan that is always that her actions are constantly being reminded. Or they're coming out of a reminder of a certain violence that's been inflicted from her father, from the Burgundians, from a variety of sources, from the soldiers who rape her sister, and I wondered about that, the pain and that solitude, that the kind of, was that violence in some ways what produced her, and is that also contributing to her isolation, a blind spot, you could say too, in the way that she's so constantly and urgently pursuing her meeting out justice in her own way.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that I think for anyone who's really brilliant, and I don't want to even say savant, but just like really brilliant or like visionary, I think to be singular is to be alone. I think that's just a condition of being ahead of one's time or being, so-called unique. I would say in terms of the violence, it's really interesting. When the book came out in Spain, which was just recently, at the end of January 2024, I mean, it generated controversy for a different reason, which I won't go into here. But a lot was made of what I said in certain interviews about how my own experience with violence as a kind of personal trauma informed the book. So I grew up in an environment that very much, like domestic abuse, like definitely infiltrated that setting. And one doesn't realize it at the time when one is writing. And I'm also thinking of, that Maya Angelou quote that's really great. I mean, I can't quote it exactly, but basically she says, it's only extreme pressure that creates a diamond, and less pressure is crystal, and less pressure is coal, and less pressure is fossilized leaves, and less than that is just plain dirt. So I was thinking about very carefully about how heroes are created, and how like the best people among us are created in the most trying times, usually, and that's where your heroism and your courage is tested. And I was also thinking too about just the role of violence and of my own trauma in my own life. And for instance, I didn't realize that the dog who dies.
Oh my God, that's so painful.
I didn't realize that that had happened to me until like well after.
That happened to me too, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway.
Have a therapy session.
Yeah, my dad killed my dog.
Yeah, my dad killed my dog.
My God! Wow.
Yeah, but like not by burning. It was just
No,
a
mine
different
neither.
way.
Mine too. Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about it.
Sorry, this is like maybe TMI, but
we're just being we're being very open about this. But
Yeah.
but I was also thinking, and this too applies to Joan's relationship with her father, which is it's an ambivalent relationship in the end, which is not just like I hate you and you hate me. It's like it's also questioning, where your gifts come from, like where your survival instinct comes from, and also where your talent and where your genius lies. Because I can say without hesitation that much of my like artistic inclinations, if you want to call it that, come from my father. Who was. I don't want to call him a failed artist because that would be cruel, but I feel his talent was wasted because it has no outlet. And I'm thinking of who Joan thinks of at the time when the Dauphin and the court essentially abandoned her, and she thinks, "You don't know my father, so you don't know me," and how her mentality towards her uncle, whom she had put at a level of almost like idol status, who had like cultivated and nurtured her, like he essentially becomes the coward.
Right.
In the end, the tables are turned, and that to me is life. Like that's wisdom. That is, and being able to grasp how human nature fluctuates and how like serpentine it is, and how it's so fluid. You can't really like Joan can't depend on anyone.
Right.
Other than herself. Like that to me was really interesting to think about.
So if you were to characterize like Joan in our present day and age, how would we see, like who might she be? This is something that I do with my students often. Sorry, and I don't mean to put you in that position, but I, it's often like thinking about these very, and they're not out of reach. These are people, and that's what I think is the beauty of what you've done, is like thinking about how would you characterize, how would you give, as I was saying, like Marjorie Kemp, who would she be? And she would definitely be tweeting, and she'd be on social media, and she'd definitely be all over the place ad infinitum, if not ad nauseum. But you'd have people like, other people might be more discreet. So who might Joan be in today's, like what would she be doing?
Yeah, I see Joan in so many women. I see Joan in, like, I guess the descendants of Joan, in a sense, and those who protest for abortion rights. I see Joan in the Ukrainian women who take up arms. For instance, like, there was an article with a very memorable photograph. Unfortunately, I can't recall the article specifically, but it showed a picture of a woman who was in an occupation that's totally like not military related, and she I don't know, maybe she was like an advertising or marketing director, and she like went through training to learn how to operate this crazy weapon, and she said like I will defend my home, my homeland. That's a direct descendant of Joan right there. I mean, I consider myself very much a radical feminist, and so I'm my own beliefs, I think, percolated into the novel, as it's kind of inevitable. I mean, one thing that I really like that Hilary Mantel said, unfortunately she's passed away, but she said that facts will keep you safe or something. I'm paraphrasing, but she said like historical facts will keep you safe, but history itself is not unbiased, and so fiction doesn't have to be.
Totally.
Yeah.
So about gender, though, I want to like talk a little bit about gender and the way that you're approaching gender in the novel, because and for those of you who don't know, in the Middle Ages, there's a different kind of idea of gender in terms of it's not necessarily always ascribed to the body. I mean, that's why kind of it becomes so interesting the way that gender is in some ways so contemporaneous. That gender, if you read something like the Roman de Silence, which I wish I could give you a copy. Anyhow, we'll do that in the United States. Okay. But the Roman de Silence is about a character, it's this 13th century roman, and about a character who goes from born a girl and then performs gender as a boy in order to receive an inheritance. And the name goes from silencius to silencia, or silencia to silencius. and it's an amazingly smart and contemporary novel that all my students love to read. And so Joan, like, how are you thinking about gender within this context? And I know you could tell us also a little bit about the way it's being adapted too, or potentially being adapted.
Well, I think with gender, I mean, one thing that's someone said that really resonated with me is, like, what would it mean for someone who's so closely associated with her faith and with her piousness to have, like, all the agency returned to her and her own body? Mm-hmm. And what would the ramifications of that be, like, on the page, in the text, or in the matter of the text? So I was thinking of that, but also I'm thinking of this very specific moment in the novel itself where one of her, I think, comrades in arms approaches her and says, like, oh, I have a bet with someone.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
right.
like whether you're actually a
does
woman.
Does she have a penis?
Yeah, does she have a cock? And she says, her answer is, I guess, very vehement, I would say. And I think Lahir is the one who cites the story of Eid, if I'm pronouncing that, YDE. So Eid and Olive. Mm-hmm. And that's about a woman who runs away from her father, who has sexual cravings towards her, like ancestral, longing for his own daughter. And so she runs away, and she becomes a knight. So she cross-dresses, and she becomes a knight, and is very successful in a number of tournaments, and that attracts attention, of course. And then I believe it's the emperor's daughter that the emperor wants Eid to marry. So that's Olive. And what happens is that obviously they can't marry. Because she's actually a woman, and so someone overhears Eid confessing this to Olive, and is a tattletale and tells on her. And what happens in the end is angelic heavenly intervention, and Eid is magically, miraculously transformed into a man, so that the marriage can take place.
Right?
And so I mean, it's an extraordinary story, and that's, like, briefly referenced in the novel. But Joan's response is, I think, very concrete in the sense that she says, why would I want to be a man? Mm-hmm. Like, it wouldn't make me stronger. Like, why would even Eid want to be a man? She says, it wouldn't make me stronger because I'm already strong. Mm-hmm. And that's very much my own authorial voice being inserted into the narrative. So, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. And so, I mean, I don't know if you want to spill any beans on the potential afterlife of, like, ways that it's being understood or read.
Oh, I mean, this is, like, very interesting. So there's, I think it's called a shopping agreement in the film industry or film TV industry. And so I think the way that the pilot is being marketed or pitched, I suppose, to use their lingo, which I'm not familiar with, is that, like, this would be, like, the first trans story. Mm-hmm. But obviously that's not true. Like, just in terms of, like, historically,
right?
Like, I'm thinking too of, like, Saint Uncumber Wilgefortis, Wilg.
You got me there. I don't know.
Well,
there are other ones though.
Yeah, there are so many others. Well, I think this is the story of a saint who, pledges her virginity to Christ, and her father wants her to marry, and then she ends up, like, growing a beard overnight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then of course that makes her, like, no one wants to marry her now, so she's able to do whatever she wants. Yeah. So that's a good example. And I think, like, in statues or in, like, pictures of her, she is portrayed with a beard.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think.
So about, like, the role of women though, and oh, sorry, I keep not talking into this loud enough. Sorry about that. So about the behind the scenes of Yolande and the kind of the backdrop and the role of the political. And it was kind of it's interesting the way you have a healthy cynicism about the political and the place of the political. And we kind of see that very much active in the political players and the manipulations and the fickleness and the popularity one day and the lack of favor in the next. And I don't know if I have a question about that, but maybe just about women's role and the way that we see women negotiating with that, because they're not authorized in the same way, so they have to use and invent authority in this world in a very different way, which is historically accurate too.
I think historically this is really interesting because there were at the time a number of points of reference for the Dauphin Charles VII to reference in terms of prophetesses who have come before. I think the most well-known one is Marie Robine, Robine. And she was miraculously, I think, healed at a tomb, and then she had visions, and she tried to seek an audience with the king at the time, but the king rejected her invitation, and she only got the queen instead, Queen Isabeau. And so I think there is this precedent of, holy women or visionaries being able to access court, and that's very interesting because that's obviously the channel that Joan
right.
Joan uses historically, and also it's interesting the story of I think it's Catherine de la Rochelle, who was introduced to Joan via an associate, like a common acquaintance, and Catherine de la Rochelle also professed to be like a prophetess or a visionary, and she specifically saw I think it's described as a certain lady in white, and what happened was she claimed to have these visions. The monk who supported her totally believed her, but Joan herself was skeptical. And what Joan did was she asked Catherine, will this lady come? And will this vision come tonight? And Catherine said, yes, she will. And then Joan fell asleep. And then in the morning she said, did the lady come? And Catherine said, yes, she did come, but you missed it because you fell asleep. And then so, Joan is intelligent, so she slept during the next day, and then she was able to stay up at night. And then the vision, of course, didn't come. And then she made a point, Joan made a point of really tearing Catherine apart, just marketing that she's false. She believed in her own visions, but she wasn't supportive of, this other lady.
Interesting, yeah.
Who also professed to have visions. So I think that's super interesting in its exclusionary nature.
So is Joan though a little starstruck with the king? I mean, I kind of got the feeling, especially when she thinks that she's friends, he's my friend.
Oh, you mean in the novel?
Yeah, in the novel. Yeah,
I think that was more her being such a as you said, what does it mean to be a figure who's totally clothed and veiled in solitude, and who's seeking company in someone who's supposed to also be a messenger of God. And it's interesting that I think historically she said so this is quite interesting. She talks about having a vision where an angel supposedly presents a crown of pure gold to the Dauphin, and later, how much credence you want to lend to these reports is up to you and up for historical debate, which I won't get into. But later she admits that this vision was not a literal vision of her seeing an angel bringing a crown of gold and putting it on the Dauphin's head. She admits that it was she says the angel was me.
Oh,
so I am promising to bring the Dauphin to his very important coronation. And so it's interesting then to consider that she was able to think symbolically.
Right, yeah.
There's this really beautiful quote from, I think, Jules Michelet, and I'm going to butcher it, but he says something like, born in the shadow of the church, lulled by the canticle of the bells, fed on legends, she became a legend herself. And so he talks about how the power of the imagination for this young woman supersedes the reality of her world. And in, I think, the research that I did, it's interesting how she talks about how the visions were especially like sharp to her, like sort of like, high dimension, what's it called? High definition. High def. When the bells were ringing. And that's, it's interesting to consider like how much one should take literally, how much is symbolic. And I think something that people don't consider, but because I'm a fiction writer, I can take whatever I want and run with it. So she was executed on May 30th, so she was burned. And then there were reports that were taken on, I think, June 7th of the year, so it's 1431, so literally like a week later, that talked about how multiple witnesses, I guess, like interviewed her on the day of her execution, so she knew she was going to die, and she knew she was going to be burned. And they said that Joan was of sound mind when she said that her visions essentially deceived her, because they promised that she would be freed, but she was going to die. So, how much you want to take these witness accounts like with a grain of salt, like that's up to you. But so like for me, when I read that was enough license for me to consider portraying the visions in a different way, which also aligns to my own relationship with faith, which is that I think as soon as you put a vision of an angel or a saint in a narrative, it totally changes the tone of the book, and it will distance you from the main character of Joan herself. Because then you'll put her on a pedestal, you'll put her on this plinth, and you won't see eye level with her, which is what I want. I want her to be as human as possible, because, the truth of the matter is, and you can't escape this, is that she was 19 years old when she was burned. And she wasn't canonized until 1920. Right. So 1431, 1920. So this isn't a situation of, Louis IX, I think, who was canonized less than 3 decades after his death. And there are very much, political reasons around her canonization. I love something that Mary Gordon said in her biography on Joan of Arc, which is, written excellently, because she's a fiction writer, so she knows style. So it's not like a scholarly work. Oh, sorry. I'm talking to the wrong person about this.
That's all right. But,
But she says something about how like canonization does nothing for the saints themselves.
Interesting.
Because the saints have already entered heaven, supposedly, right?
Right.
And I believe this, so their eternal soul is already, safely with God. But she says canonization only does things for the living.
Right. Yeah.
And what the living require is very much determined by pressures put on the church.
Interesting. I think we are now at the time where we get questions from the. I know, it's like we're having fun, and where we can see about questions from both the audience and the Zoom. I think.
Can we have a big round of applause first, please?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for being the moderator for this. I have to say, like, as a graduate student, this is kind of an aside. My relationship to professors has kind of changed. Like, I used to, I do still, like, look up to them and worship them, but, like, as a grad student, the dynamic has shifted, and so this kind of feels like French and Burgundian, like, we're actually allies, or we should be allies. Yay. And this is like a treaty, like a peace treaty.
Okay, I like that.
It's good to get along with faculty.
Phew. All right.
We'll make you guys shake hands at the end of it. Don't worry. All right, we will now open this up to questions. We'll start with our in-person audience, and then if we have time, we'll do some Zoom questions as well. Raise your hand very high, and I will bring you the microphone. Yes, I see a hand in a lovely turquoise shirt.
Thank you. I loved reading your novel. And aside from your novel, all I know is kind of the legend of Jeanne d'Arc. And so I was just really curious about your choices that, my own research is contemporary, not medieval. And so I don't know, you begin the novel with the fight with the children and the death of the young boy, and that's so important. And I'm just wondering, I'm guessing it's fictional, but I'm just kind of curious about that choice. If it was fictional, how you came upon that to begin the novel.
Actually, that's a really good question, and thank you for reading the novel. There are so many choices now. I mean, I'm competing with Colleen Hoover, so it's and Netflix. I was thinking of the trial transcripts, and I think it's interesting when you do research, and the more research that you do, you eventually have to depart from it at some point. But also, research gives you a lot of fodder and a lot of material to work off of. And I think when I was reading the trial transcripts, Joan briefly mentions fights that the children from her hometown of Domremy had with children from the neighboring village of Maxey, which was obviously Burgundian aligned. And so the rock fights did happen, and she said that the children would come back bloodied and bruised, I believe, from those rock fights. So that is what prompted that opening scene. And I was also interested too in what did you say about this? Was really good about the microcosmic and macro, the micro and the macro. How I wanted to show a dimension of war that was totally domestic. And that lived in the village, because war is not just the battle.
Okay.
It's not just a fenced off battlefield.
Right.
It percolates into every part of your identity and to one's lifestyle. And the violence of the battlefield is also the violence of the home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Other questions in the room? Yes. I'll come around the long way.
I was intrigued when you mentioned your loyalty as a writer is to the imagination and the world of the novel. What do you think, if anything, you as a historical fiction writer owe the real life characters that you write about?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that's something that has come up certainly in readerly criticism, which I could be very open about, which is, are you perverting the legacy of Joan by portraying her in this way? And I would say no, because she's been appropriated by so many movements, and she's been appropriated by a right-wing group in France, right? They collect under her statue. And she's been appropriated by this Catholic Church, obviously, suffragist movement. Was she really a feminist? And also as a gay icon. And one would question whether historically she was very much a royalist, and she was both ahead of her time, but also very traditional too in some of her beliefs. So I would say that with such an amorphous character, it depends on who you're writing about, but I would say that with such a character who has entered into legend and also into myth, and who's become so much more than herself, and who's become kind of this marble statue that's too smooth and too pure, that for me as a fiction writer opens the door for trying to make her human. And so if I've succeeded in doing that within the context of the novel, I would be comfortable with that, knowing that there are other versions of Joan of Arc that you could easily go to. If you wanted to read Mark Twain's version, or Shaw's version, or Schiller's version, or Bertolt Brecht. There are so many authors that you could turn to if you want the male gaze, essentially.
We have a question from Zoom. Joanna Fisher has sent in a lovely question. She says, "My confirmation name is Jeanne d'Arc, and it is interesting that I never saw her as a saint, rather as a brave woman who saw that importance of taking a political position. Can we experience her from this position? Can a woman take a political position simply for that reason, seeing it from a pragmatic perspective?" And she finishes by saying, "I too am a medievalist, but yet I try to place her as a woman who at the very least had some individual agency as a person."
Yeah, that's interesting there's this paradox or conflict between seeing Joan as a saint and seeing Joan as a military leader, like how to reconcile those two images, which is something that I didn't struggle with when I was writing the book, because, well, I mean, an important question for me is, I guess, the issue of how expansive love can be. So I think Joan, at the beginning of the novel, she loves only a certain small number of people. For instance, her sister, her uncle, whatever, her dog. And then in the end, her love becomes so much more expansive, and she loves the Kingdom of France, and
the enemy.
And the enemy, yes, and like the lay person who is essentially suffering from war. And to me, that is true sainthood. I'm thinking of too, like the poem by Leigh Hunt, is it Abu Ben Adam? So he talks about, so the main character, I think an angel appears to him and with a list, and he says, like, am I on the list of those who love God? And the angel says, no, you're not. And he says, well, then put me on the list as one who loves his fellow man. And the next night, the angel comes to him with the list, and his name is at the top of the list. So, like, to love one's fellow man is, I think, by extension, to love God. And that is the true purpose of serving, and I think of faith. At least my understanding of it.
There was another question in the room. Yes.
Firstly, thank you very much for writing the book and for sharing everything here tonight. For me, reading Joan was like looking at a really intricate painting with lots of layers and layers and layers and stories within stories. I was wondering if that was reflective of your writing process?
Yeah, I think so. That's a really good question. Just in terms of the drafts one goes through, I would say that I've probably rewritten this novel maybe close to 3 times, and because the revisions are so extensive that you might as well be rewriting. So, like, I think the end product is obviously what you see, but behind it there is this layering of, I mean, obviously editorial work by my wonderful editor, Caitlin McKenna, who's a dream to work with, and she's also responsible for, the short sentences that you, like the sparsity of the prose. That's what a good editor does. And also, like, I was thinking about this, about how, like, big authors, their works just tend to get longer and longer because they don't listen to their editors anymore. Like, how does a 500-page novel become, like, 700 pages or even more? But, yeah, I think it's almost like there's this, I don't want to say, like, archaeology behind a book of, you see these, like, layers of, like, time and also where you were located in that time when you were writing the novel. One person once said to me, like, a novel's always written by your past self. I think that's very true. So, like, I've since, I guess, like, spiritually moved on from Joan. I mean, she's always with me, but, like, mentally I've kind of moved on. But, like, at the time, it's, like, who I was and who I was informed by my experiences at the time very much also informed the output, the creative output.
So now you're King Arthur?
No, Morgan Le Fay, King
Morgan.
Arthur.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Other questions in the room? Don't be shy. I can ask a question that's cheating a bit because I've already talked about it with you, Katherine, but we were discussing before this event your decision to end the book where you did, and you mentioned that was received with a certain amount of skepticism or controversy, that you did not include the trials. Could you speak to that decision a bit?
Yeah, I honestly don't see the point of including the trials. I mean, I guess, like, a few people, not like actual, I don't want to say like actual, like, literary critics, but, readers, they said, like, I copped out. Like, I took the easy way out because I didn't include the extensive back and forth, like, trial examination, but also, like, that doesn't translate well to fiction. I think because it's so, first of all, there were multiple sessions, and the sessions are very repetitive, and a lot of it is, like, Joan back-talking, to her interrogators, like answering questions but not quite answering them, like refusing to take the oath over and over again, like giving these figures of authority a very hard time. And so like that was informative for me in terms of showing her personality and like maybe gaining a sense of her voice, which is obviously very resonant even across like all these centuries. You can still see that in the trial transcripts. But in terms of translating that scene by scene, I don't think that would work well. And also, I'm not a huge fan of, my editor and I talked about this, about how hard it would be to show the reader her burning corpse at the end of the novel. It's not that I wanted to end on an optimistic note, but I wanted to end on a note where life obviously means a lot to her. And so it's not martyrdom, which... it's like if she could, she would choose life. She wants to continue to live. And so I think we have a sense of, with like the martyrs and the saints, that they should go very placidly to their deaths and that it's an honor to die in horrific ways, as long as it's for a good cause. And I don't agree with this.
No, I appreciate that. I'm also curious about tenderness. Like there are moments of tenderness in the role of women. For example, her sister, that the places where she really finds, her mother's pretty absent. Her sister's really the more kind of loving, present, nurturing figure. And then Yolande and her daughter, there are different ways in which people see her. And it's not that she needs to be seen as a superhuman person, but just being seen in a singular way is what kind of those give moments of extreme tenderness in the novel.
Yeah, for me, I'm glad you brought up Catherine the sister, because for me, like, she is Saint Catherine. Mm-hmm. That's the way I translated the vision of Catherine the saint to Catherine the sister. But I think I would also emphasize that in the book, it was really important for me, writing it, to feel that Joan is always seen by God. And that she, I think, has moments of extreme doubt and occasionally perhaps gives up on a higher faith. But God never gives up on her. So, going back to Emily's point about the ending, it's almost that in the end she's kind of achieved this universal visionary status of being able to envision a future for herself where she's immortalized. So that's a prophecy in and of itself, of visualizing one's legacy and what that means to, for the common good and for the Kingdom of France.
So in some way she gives up her own personhood for others.
Because that's what the best people do.
I see, okay.
Yeah. It's, the best people, it's not about you anymore.
Right.
It's about the world at large and how you serve it. Yeah.
That's a nice place to end.
Can we have a final round of applause, please?
Thank you.